Hello again. This is Mrs. Inskeep, and I am reading Fantastic Mr. Fox by Roald Dahl, and it's a story about a family of foxes who are trying to stay safe from some farmers who are trying to kill them because they keep stealing food from the farmers' farms. So, I've read 9 chapters already. The 10th one is called Bogus's Chicken House Number 1. This time we must go in a very special direction, said Mr. Fox, pointing sideways and downward. So he and his 4 children started to dig once again. The work went much more slowly now, yet they kept at it with great courage, and little by little the tunnel began to grow. "Dad, I wish you could tell us where we are going," said one of the children. "I dare not do that," said Mr. Fox, "because this place I'm hoping to get to is so marvelous that if I described it to you now, you would go crazy with excitement. And then, if we failed to get there, which is very possible, you would die of disappointment. I don't want to raise your hopes too much, my darling." For a long time they kept on digging. For how long they did not know, because there was no nights and no days down there in that murky tunnel. But at last Mr. Fox gave the order to stop. "I think," he said, "we had better take a peep upstairs now and see where we are. I know where I want to be, but I can't possibly sure we're anywhere near it." Slowly, wearily, the foxes began to slope the tunnel up toward the surface. Up and up it went, until suddenly they came to something hard above their heads, and they couldn't go up any further. Mr. Fox reached up to examine this hard thing. "It's wood," he whispered. "Wooden plank." "What does that mean, Dad?" "It means, unless I'm very much mistaken, that we are right beneath somebody's house," whispered Mr. Fox. "Be very quiet now while I take a peek." Carefully, Mr. Fox began pushing up one of the floorboards. The board creaked most terribly, and they all ducked down, waiting for something awful to happen. Nothing did. So Mr. Fox pushed up a second board, and then, very, very cautiously, he poked his head up through the gap. He let out a shriek of excitement. "I've done it! I've done it! First time! I've done it! I've done it!" He pulled himself up through the gap in the floor and started prancing and dancing with joy. "Come on up," he sang out. "Come up and see where you are, my darling. What a sight for a hungry fox. Hallelujah! Hooray! Hooray!" The 4 small foxes scrambled up out of the tunnel, and what a fantastic sight it was now that met their eyes. They were in a huge shed, and the whole place was filled with chickens. There were white chickens, brown chickens, black chickens, 5,000. "Bogus's Chicken House Number 1, cried Mr. Fox. "It's exactly what I was aiming at. I hit it slap in the middle, first time. Isn't that fantastic? And if I do say myself, it's really rather clever." The small foxes went wild with excitement. They started running around in all directions, chasing the stupid chicken. "Wait," ordered Mr. Fox. "Don't lose your head. Stand back. Calm down. Let's do this properly. First of all, everybody, take a drink of water." They all ran over to the chicken's drinking trough and lapped up the lovely cool water. Then Mr. Fox chose 3 of the plumpest hens, and with a clever flick of his jaws, he killed them instantly. "Now, back to the tunnel," he ordered. "Come on, no fooling around. The quicker you move, the quicker you'll have something to eat." One after another, they climbed down through the hole in the floor, and soon they were all standing once again in the dark tunnel. Mr. Fox reached up and pulled the floorboard back into place. He did this with great care. He did it so that no one could tell they'd ever been moved. "My son," he said, giving the 3 plump hens to the biggest of his 4 children, "run back with these to your mother. Tell her to prepare a feast. Tell her the rest of us will be along in a jiffy as soon as we made a few other little arrangements." The next chapter is called A Surprise for Mrs. Fox, and it's chapter 11. The small fox ran back along the tunnel as fast as he could, carrying the 3 plump hens. He was exploding with joy. "Just wait," he kept thinking. "Just wait till Mommy sees thee." He had a long way to run, but he never stopped once on the way, and he came bursting in upon Mrs. Fox. "Mommy," he cried out of breath. "Look, Mommy, look! Wake up and see what I brought you." Mrs. Fox, who was weaker than ever now from lack of food, opened one eye and looked at the hens. "I'm dreaming," she murmured, and closed the eye again. You're not dreaming, Mummy. They're real chickens. We're safe. We're not going to starve. Mrs. Fox opened both eyes and sat up quickly. But, my dear child, where on earth? Bogus's chicken house number 1, spluttered the small fox. We tunneled right up under the floor, and you've never seen so many big fat hens in all your life. And Dad said to prepare a feast. They'll be back soon. The sight of food seemed to give new strength to Mrs. Fox. A feast it shall be, she said, standing up. Oh, what a fantastic fox your father is. Hurry up, child, and start plucking those chickens. Far away down in the tunnel, the fantastic Mr. Fox was saying, Now for the next bit, my darlings. This one will be as easy as pie. All we have to do is dig another little tunnel from here to there. To where, Dad? Don't ask so many questions. Start digging. Okay, this chapter is chapter 12, and it's called Badger. Now, Mrs. Fox, or Mr. Fox, and the 3 remaining small foxes dug fast and straight. They were all too excited now to feel tired or hungry. They knew they were going to have a whacking great feast before long, and the fact that it was none other than Bogus's chickens they were going to eat made them chortle with laughter every time they thought of it. It was lovely to realize that while the fat farmer was sitting up there on the hill, waiting for them to starve, he was also giving them their dinner without knowing it. Keep digging, said Mr. Fox. It's not much further. All of a sudden, a deep voice above their heads said, Who goes there? The foxes jumped. They looked up quickly, and they saw, peeking through a small hole in the roof of the tunnel, a long back, black, pointed, furry face. Badger! Cried Mr. Fox. Foxy! Cried Badger. My goodness me, I'm glad I found someone at last. I've been digging around in circles for 3 days and nights, and I haven't had the foggiest idea of where I am. Badger made the hole in the ceiling bigger and dropped down beside the foxes. A small badger, his son, dropped down after him. Haven't you heard what's happening on the hill? Badger said excitedly. It's chaos. Half the wood has disappeared, and there are men with guns all over the countryside. None of us can get out even at night. We're all starving to death. Who is we? Asked Mr. Fox. All of us diggers. That's me, Mole, and Rabbit, and all our wives and children. Even Weasel, who can usually sneak out of the tightest spots, is right now hiding down my hole with Mrs. Weasel and 6 kids. What on earth are we going to do, Foxy? I think we're finished. Mr. Fox looked at his 3 children, and he smiled. The children smiled back at him, sharing his secret. My dear old Badger, he said, this mess you're in is all my fault. I know it's your fault, said Badger furiously, and the farmers are not going to give up till they've got you. Unfortunately, that means us as well. It means everyone on the hill. Badger sat down and put a paw around his small son. We're done for, he said. My poor wife up there is so weak she can't dig another yard. Nor can mine, said Mr. Fox, and yet at this very minute she's preparing for me and my children the most delicious feast of plump, juicy chicken. Stop, cried Badger. Don't tease me. I can't stand it. It's true, cried the smallest foxes. Dad's not teasing. We've got chickens galore. And because everything is entirely my fault, said Mr. Fox, I invite you to share the feast. I invite everyone, you, Mole, Rabbit, Weasel, and all your wives and children. There'll be plenty to go around, I can assure you. You mean it? Cried Badger. You really mean it? Mr. Fox pushed his face close to Badger's and whispered, Do you know where we've just been? Where? Right inside Bogus's chicken house number 1. No! Yes, that is nothing to where we are going now. You have to come just at the right moment, my dear Badger. You can help us dig. And in the meantime, your small son can run back to Mrs. Badger and all the others and spread the good news. Mr. Fox turned to the small badger and said, Tell them they are invited to a fox's feast. Then bring them all down here and follow this tunnel back until you find my home. Yes, Mr. Fox, said the small badger. Yes, sir, right away, sir. Oh, thank you, sir. And he scrambled quickly through the hole in the roof of the tunnel and disappeared. This is chapter 13, and it's called Bunce's Giant Storehouse. My dear Foxy, cried Badger, what in the world has happened to your tail? Don't talk about it, please, said Mr. Fox. It's a painful subject. They were digging the new tunnel. They dug on in silence. Badger was a great digger, and the tunnel went forward at a terrific pace now that he was lending a paw. Soon they were crouching underneath yet another wooden floor. Mr. Fox grinned shyly, showing sharp white teeth. "If I'm not mistaken, my dear Badger," he said, "we are now underneath the farm which belongs to that nasty little pot-bellied dwarf, Bugs. We are, in fact, directly underneath the most interesting part of the farm." "Ducks and geese!" cried the small foxes, licking their lips. "Juicy, tender ducks and big, fat geese." "Exactly," said Mr. Fox. "But how in the world can you know where we are?" asked Badger. Mr. Fox grinned again, showing even more white teeth. "Look, I know my way around these farms blindfold. For me, it's just as easy below ground as it is above it." He reached high and pushed up one wooden floorboard, then another. He poked his head through the gap. "Yes," he shouted, jumping up into the room above. "I've done it again. I hit it smack on the nose, right in the bullseye. Come and look." Quickly, Badger and the three small foxes scrambled up after him. They stopped and stared. They stood and gaped. They were overwhelmed. They couldn't speak. But what they now saw was a kind of a fox's dream, a badger's dream, a paradise for hungry animals. "This, my dear old Badger," proclaimed Mr. Fox, "is Bunce's mighty storehouse. All his finest stuff is stored in here before he sends it off to market. Against all the four walls of the great room, stacked in cupboards and piled on shelves, reaching from floor to ceiling, were thousands and thousands of the finest and fattest ducks and geese, plucked and ready for roasting. And up above, dangling from the rafters, there must have been at least 100 smoked hams and 50 sides of bacon. "Just feast your eyes on that!" cried Mr. Fox, dancing up and down. "What do you think of it, huh? Pretty good grub." Suddenly, as though springs had been released in their legs, the three hungry small foxes gave the ravenously hungry Badger, and the ravenously hungry Badger sprang forward to grab the luscious food. "Stop!" ordered Mr. Fox. "This is my party, so I will do the choosing." The others fell back, licking their chops. Mr. Fox began prowling around the storehouse, examining the glorious display with an expert eye. A thread of saliva slid down one side of his jaw and hung suspended in midair and then snapped. "We mustn't overdo it," he said. "Mustn't give the game away. Mustn't let them know that we've been up to it. We must be neat and tidy and take just a few of the choicest morsels. So, to start with, we shall have 4 plump young ducks." He took them from the shelf. "Oh, how lovely and fat they are. No wonder Bunce gets a special price for them in the market. All right, Badger, lend me a hand to get them down. You children can help as well. There we go. Goodness me, look how your mouths are watering. And now, I think we better have a few geese. 3 will be quite enough. We'll take the biggest. And oh my, you'll never see finer geese than these in the king's kitchen. Gently does it. That's the way. And now, what about a couple of nice smoked ham? I adore smoked ham, don't you, Badger? Fetch me that step ladder, will you, please?" And Mr. Fox climbed up the ladder and handed down 3 magnificent hams. "And do you like bacon, Badger?" "I'm mad about bacon," cried Badger, dancing with excitement. "Let's have a side of bacon, that big one up there." "And carrots, Dad," said the smallest of the 3 small foxes. "We must take some of those carrots." "Don't be a twerp," said Mr. Fox. "You know we never eat things like that." "It's not for us, Dad. It's for the rabbits. They only eat vegetables." "Oh, my goodness. You are right," cried Mr. Fox. "What a thoughtful little fellow you are. Take 10 bunches of carrots." Soon all this lovely loot was lying in a neat heap on the floor. The small foxes crouched close, their noses twitching, their eyes shining like stars. "And now," said Mr. Fox, "we shall have to borrow from our friend Bunce 2 of these useful push carts over in the corner." He and Badger fetched the push carts, and the ducks and the geese and the ham and bacon were loaded onto them. Quickly the push carts were lowered through the hole in the floor, and the animals slid down after them. Back in the tunnel, Mr. Fox again pulled the floorboards very carefully into place so that no one could see they had been moved. "My darlings," he said, pointing to 2 of the 3 small foxes, "take a cart each and run back as fast as you can to your mother. Give her my love and tell her we are having guests for supper. The badgers, the moles, the rabbits, and the weasels. Tell her it must be a truly great feast. And tell her the rest of us will be home as soon as we've done one more little job. Yes, Dad, right away, Dad, they answered, and they grabbed a trolley each and went rushing off down the tunnel. This is chapter 14, and it's called Badger Has Doubts. Just one more visit, cried Mr. Fox. And I bet I know where that'll be, said the only small fox now left. He was the smallest fox of them all. Where? Said Badger. Well, said the smallest fox, we've been to Bogus's and we've been to Bun's, but we haven't been to Bean. It must be Bean. You're right, said Mr. Fox, but what you don't know is which part of Bean's place we are going to visit. Which? They both said together. Aha, said Mr. Fox, just you wait and see. They were digging as they talked. The tunnel was going forward fast. Suddenly Badger said, doesn't this worry you just a tiny bit, Foxy? Worry me, said Mr. Fox. What? All the stealing? Mr. Fox stopped digging and stared at Badger as though he'd gone completely crazy. My dear old furry frump, he said, do you know anyone in the whole world who wouldn't swipe a few chickens if his children were starving? There was a short silence while Badger thought deeply about this. You are far too respectable, said Mr. Fox. There's nothing wrong with being respectable, Badger said. Look, said Mr. Fox, Bogus and Buns and Bean are out to kill us. You realize that, I hope. I do, Foxy, I do indeed, said the gentle Badger. But we're not going to stoop to their level. We don't want to kill them. I should hope not indeed, said Badger. We wouldn't dream of it, said Mr. Fox. We shall simply take a little food here and there to keep us and our families alive, right? Well, I suppose we'll have to, said Badger. If they want to be horrible, let them, said Mr. Fox. We down here are decent, peace-loving people. Badger laid his head on one side and smiled at Mr. Fox. Foxy, he said, I love you. Thank you, said Mr. Fox. And now, let's get on with the digging. 5 minutes later, Badger's front paws hit against something flat and hard. What on earth is this? He said. It looks like a stone wall. He and Mr. Fox scraped away the soil. It was a wall, but it was built of brick, not stone. The wall was right in front of them, blocking their way. Now, who in the world would build a wall under the ground? Asked Badger. Very simple, said Mr. Fox. It's the wall of an underground room, and if I'm not mistaken, it's exactly what I'm looking for. This next chapter is called Bean's Secret Cider Cellar. It's chapter 15. Mr. Fox examined the wall carefully. He saw that the cement between the bricks was old and crumbly, so he loosened the brick without much trouble and pulled it away. Suddenly, out from the hole where the brick had been, there popped a small, sharp face with whiskers. Go away, it snapped. You can't come in here. It's private. Goodness, said Badger. It's a rat. You saucy beast, said Mr. Fox. I should have guessed we'd find you down here somewhere. Go away, shrieked Rat. Go on, beat it. This is my private place. Be quiet, said Mr. Fox. I will not, shrieked Rat. This is my place. I got here first. Mr. Fox gave a brilliant smile, flashing his white teeth. My dear Rat, he said, I am a hungry fellow, and if you don't hop it quickly, I shall eat you up in one gulp. That did it. The rat popped back fast out of sight. Mr. Fox laughed and began pulling more brick out of the wall. When he had made a biggish hole, he crept through it. Badger and the small fox followed him. They found themselves in a vast, damp, gloomy cellar. This is it, cried Mr. Fox. This is what? Said Badger. The place is empty. Where are the turkeys? Asked the smallest fox, staring into the gloom. I thought Bean was a turkey farmer. He is a turkey farmer, said Mr. Fox. But we're not after turkeys now. We've got plenty of food. Then what do we need, Dad? Take a good look around, said Mr. Fox. Don't you see anything that interests you? Badger and the smallest fox peered into the half-darkness. As their eyes became accustomed to the gloom, they began to see what looked like a whole lot of big glass jars standing on shelves around the wall. They went closer. They were jars. There were hundreds of them, and on each one was one word written, and that word was cider. The smallest fox looked high in the air. "Oh, Dad, look what we found is cider." "Exactly," said Mr. Fox. "Tremendous," shouted Badger. "Bean's secret cider cellar," said Mr. Fox. "But go carefully, my dears. Don't make any noise. This cellar is right underneath the farmhouse itself." "Cider," said Badger, "is especially good for badgers. We take it as medicine. One large glass 3 times a day with meals and another at bedtime." "It'll make the feast into a banquet," said Mr. Fox. While they were talking, the smallest fox had sneaked a jar off the shelf and had taken a gulp. "Wow!" he gasped. "Wowee!" You must understand, this was not ordinary, weak, fuzzy cider that one buys in the store. It was the real stuff, and it burned his throat. "Ah!" gasped the smallest fox. "This is some cider." "That's quite enough of that," said Mr. Fox, grabbing the jar and putting it to his lips. He took a tremendous gulp. "It's miraculous! It's fabulous!" "It's my turn," said Badger, taking the jar and tilting his head back. The cider gurgled and bubbled down his throat. "It's like melted gold," he gasped. "Oh, Foxy, it's like drinking sunbeams and rainbows." "You're poaching!" shrieked the rat. "Put that down at once. There'll be none left for me." Rat was perched on the highest shelf in the cellar, peering out from behind a huge jar. There was a small rubber tube inserted in the neck of the jar, and Rat was using this tube to suck out the cider. "And if you great crumbly beasts come messing around here, we're all going to get caught. Get out and leave me alone to my cider." At that moment, they heard a woman's voice calling out in the house above them. "Hurry up and get that cider, Mabel," a voice called. "You know Mr. Bean doesn't like to be kept waiting, especially when he's been out all night in a tent." The animals froze. They stayed absolutely still. Their ears pricked, their bodies tense. Then they heard the sound of a door being opened. The door was at the top of the flight of stone steps leading down from the house to the cellar, and now someone was starting to come down. Okay, we're at the next chapter, and it's chapter 16, and it's called The Woman. "Quick!" said Mr. Fox. "Hide!" He and Badger and the smallest fox jumped up onto a shelf and crouched behind a row of big cider jugs. Peering around the jars, they saw a huge woman coming down into the cellar. At the foot of the steps, the woman paused, looking right and left. Then she turned and headed straight for the place where Mr. Fox and Badger and the smallest fox were hiding. She stopped right in front of them. The only thing between her and them was a row of cider jars. She was clothed. Mr. Fox could hear the sound of her breathing. Peeping through the crack between 2 bottles, she noticed that she had a big rolling pin in one hand. "How many will he want this time, Mrs. Bean?" the woman shouted. And from the top of the steps, the other voice called back, "Bring up 2 or 3 jars." "He drank 4 yesterday, Mrs. Bean." "Yes, but he won't want that many today because he's not going to be up there more than a few hours longer. He says the fox is bound to make a run for it this morning. It can't possibly stay down that hole another day without food." The woman in the cellar reached out and lifted a jar of cider from the shelf. The jar she took was next to, but one to the jar behind which Mr. Fox was crouching. "I'm glad when that rotten brute is killed and strung up on the front porch," she called out. "And by the way, Mrs. Bean, your husband promised I can have the tail as a souvenir." "The tail's been all shot to pieces," said the voice. "Didn't you know that?" "You mean it's ruined?" "Of course it's ruined. They shot the tail off it, but missed the fox." "Oh, no," said the big woman. "I did want that tail." "You can have the head instead, Mabel. You can get it stuffed and hang it on your bedroom wall. Now hurry up with that cider." "Yes, ma'am, I'm coming," said the big woman, and she took the second jar from the shelf. "If she takes one more, she'll see it," thought Mr. Fox. He could feel the smallest fox's body pressed tightly against his own, quivering with excitement. "Will 2 be enough, Mrs. Bean, or shall I take 3? "Goodness, Mabel, I don't care as long as you get a move on it." "Then 2 it is," said the huge woman, speaking to herself. "He drinks too much of that stuff anyway." Carrying a jar in each hand and with the rolling pin tucked under one arm, she walked away across the cellar. At the foot of the steps, she paused and looked around, sniffing the air. "There's rats down here again, Mrs. Bean. I can smell them." Then poison them, woman, poison them. You know where the poison's kept. Yes, ma'am, Mabel said. She climbed slowly out of sight in the steps, and the door slammed. Quick, said Mr. Fox, grab a jar each and run for it. Rat stood on his high shelf and shrieked. What did I tell you? You nearly got nabbed, didn't you? You nearly gave the game away. You keep out of here from now on. I don't want you around. This is my place. You, said Mr. Fox, are going to get poisoned. Poppycock, said Rat. I sit up here and watch her put that stuff down. She'll never get me. Mr. Fox and Badger and the smallest fox ran across the cellar, clutching a gallon jar each. Goodbye, Rat, they called out as they disappeared through the hole in the wall. Thanks for the lovely cider. Thieves, shrieked Rat. Robbers, bandits, burglars. The next chapter is 17. It's called The Great Feast. Back in the tunnel, they paused so Mr. Fox could brick up the hole in the wall. He was humming to himself as he put the bricks back in place. I can still taste that glorious cider, he said. What an impudent fellow Rat is. He has bad manners, Badger said. All rats have bad manners. I've never met a polite rat yet. And he drinks too much, said Mr. Fox, putting the last brick in place. There we are, now home to the feast. They grabbed their jars of cider, and off they went. Mr. Fox was in front, the smallest fox came next, and Badger last. Along the tunnel they flew, past the churning that led to Bunce's mighty storehouse, past Bunce's chicken house number 1, and up the long home stretch toward the place where they knew Mrs. Fox would be waiting. Keep it up, my darling, shouted Mr. Fox. We'll soon be there. Think what's waiting for us at the other end, and just think what we're bringing home with us in these jars. That ought to cheer up poor Mrs. Fox. And Mr. Fox sang a little song as he ran. Home again, swiftly I glide, back to my beautiful bride. She'll not feel so rotten as soon as she's gotten some cider inside her inside. Then Badger joined in. Oh, poor Mrs. Badger, he cried. So hungry she's very near died. But she'll not feel so hollow if only she'll swallow some cider inside. They were still singing as they rounded the final corner and burst in upon the most wonderful and amazing sight any of them had ever seen. The feast was just beginning. A large dining room had been hollowed out of the earth, and in the middle of it, seated around a huge table, were no less than 29 animals. They were Mrs. Fox and 3 small foxes, Mrs. Badger and 3 small badgers, Mole and Mrs. Mole and 4 small moles, Rabbit and Mrs. Rabbit and 5 small rabbits, Weasel and Mrs. Weasel and 6 small weasels, and the table was covered with chicken and ducks and geese and ham and bacon, and everyone was tucking into the lovely food. I'll show you a picture of that feast. My darling, cried Mr. Fox, jumping up and hugging Mrs. Fox. My darling, cried Mrs. Fox, jumping up and hugging Mr. Fox. We couldn't wait. Please forgive us. Then she hugged the smallest fox of all, and Mrs. Badger hugged Badger, and everyone hugged everyone else. Amid shouts of joy, the great jars of cider were placed upon the table, and Mr. Fox and Badger and the smallest fox sat down with the others. You must remember, no one had eaten a thing for several days. They were ravenous. So, for a while, there was no conversation at all. There was only the sound of crunching and chewing as the animals attacked the succulent food. At last, Badger stood up. He raised a glass of cider and called out, "A toast! I want all of you to stand and drink a toast to our dear friend who has saved our lives to this day, Mr. Fox." "To Mr. Fox," they all shouted, standing up and raising their glasses. "To Mr. Fox, long may he live." Then Mrs. Fox got shyly to her feet and said, "I don't want to make a speech. I just want to say one thing, and that is, my husband is a fantastic fox." And everyone clapped and cheered. Then Mr. Fox himself stood up. "This delicious meal," he began, "this delicious meal, my friends, is by courtesy of Mr. Bogus, Mr. Bunce, and Mr. Bean." More cheering and laughter. "And I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have." And number 18's chapter is called Still Waiting. Outside the fox's hole, Bogus and Buns and Beans sat beside their tents with their guns on their lap. It was beginning to rain. Water was trickling down the necks of the three men and into their shoes. "He won't stay down there much longer now," Bogus said. "The brute must be famished," Buns said. "That's right," Beans said. "He'll be making a dash for it any moment. Keep your guns handy." And they sat there by the hole, waiting for the fox to come out. And so far as I know, they're still waiting. I hope you enjoyed this story. It was nice that Mr. Fox thought of the other diggers down there and gave them some food from the storehouse. So anyway, Roald Dahl is a good writer. He wrote James and the Giant Peach, but this book, Fantastic Mr. Fox, is a fun one. So I hope you enjoyed it, and happy reading to all of you.